Hi everyone, it's Professor Hall, and today we are talking about imagery. Possibly a little bit of a shorter lecture, but we'll try. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about different types of imagery. I'm going to show you some different tools that I use as a writer when working on imagery, and then just as a few examples, and it should be kind of fun. And then we'll do an example that tries to combine all the different types of imagery, hopefully without making us too dizzy. So let's get started. I want to say my real first tip, and really my only tip for imagery, is to have some and not have too much. And that we're going to talk about style in a couple weeks, how much imagery you want to include and what types, and how your sentence structures go when you're talking about imagery. If you have shorter sentences, longer flowy sentences, if you shove a lot of images in there, the word choice you use, all of that really has to do with your style. So I guess tip number one is look for a balance, some but not too much. I find that a lot of newer authors are kind of on either side of this spectrum. Either they really have no imagery and they need it for things like setting details, characterization, helping the reader picture the story in their mind. And other people have so much that it takes over the story and it gets in the way of the plot. And so you want to have a balance. My other tip is to consider your style. So we're going to talk about that, as I said, later, but things like word choice, sentence structures, my typing today, types of imagery, etc. What types you're going to use or employ. You don't have to think of imagery as just that flowery, excessive stuff. It doesn't have to be like that. So what are the different types of imagery? The first, probably the one that people think of the most, is visual. Visual imagery has to do with images describing what you are seeing. So things that go into this, shapes, colors, anything that describes what a narrator or character is looking at, or what you want the reader, the audience, to look at. So, for example, the sapphire sea with its white-tipped waves was surrounded by an almost alabaster. I would not write like this in normal life. An almost alabaster beach of pristine sand, punctuated here and there by clumps of emerald grasses. Okay, just what you're seeing. Now, there are a couple tips here of things that you can do. You can use interesting, as I did here, adjectives when describing your scene. Consider strong words that can really get across your meaning. And I mentioned up here shape, color, the size of things, those words that that we use when we're describing what things look like. The brown bookshelf behind me, shoved full of books, but only on the top two shelves because I've taken the rest of the books home because of COVID. So you get an image in your head, even if you didn't quite see the empty shelves below the first two. Those types of things. And also color. Color is sometimes symbolic, and it not only creates an impression, I have found, but also adds to the emotion, the mood of a scene. So here we have a sapphire sea, it's blue, right? Let's take that and just change the color and see what happens. The puce green sea with I don't quite want white, right? I want kind of off-white. So let me say ivory tipped waves was surrounded by an almost, instead of almost alabaster, I'm going to say beige. Beige beach of, now, that doesn't fit with this, and I don't like ivory here, but we'll say, can we say yellow? Let's say yellow. Pristine doesn't fit then, right? Dirty. And clumps of, oh, I want a green. Let me look at some synonyms. Pea green. Again, I wouldn't have puce green and pea green there. I'd say, just let's say grasses. But you can see, even by changing the sea from sapphire to puce green, what a difference that makes in, it changes the mood of the scene. So sapphire says beautiful, puce green says gross. I would assume that sapphire goes with pristine, that it's so clear you can see through it like a gem. Puce green says there's some maybe sewage in there or something. There's pollution going on. This is not a beach that I want to go to. White sands versus beige. The white alabaster sands versus the beige. Does it have to be quite this detailed? No. You could have, you could have a character say, I walked toward the sparkling water, avoiding the clumps of grass poking up through the sand. Okay, now we still get a similar image to the first one, but it's in a little bit of a different style, right? So again, think about your style and how you want to describe things when you're using imagery. All right, visual. Now we move to auditory. So, auditory imagery describes things we hear. So we have loud, soft, we have instruments, we have voices, we have machinery, the sounds of the city, so to speak. Other things, music, tempo, pitch. These do not always have to do with music, but these are just things that you would consider rhythms, etc. Describing how we hear things. So, things to consider with this, I think with auditory and then with kinesthetic, which we'll talk about next, you might want to carefully consider your adverbs. For example, Carol talked loudly. Loudly is our adverb sentence. Can we have instead a stronger verb? Carol, Carlo, Carol screeched. So carefully consider adverbs and think about strong verbs instead. I think a lot of times people want to use some of the auditory imagery, and then it comes out with adverbs they don't necessarily need. So let's think of a scene we could describe that doesn't involve music but still would have some auditory imagery. Okay, we're in a large, let's say we're in New York City. As who's going to walk across the street? Greg. As Greg tried to cross the street, he was almost overwhelmed by the sounds of the city. Used to the quiet Adirondack mountains, the constant beeping of horns, screech of car brakes. What else would we have there on a street? Sirens, maybe. And sirens was too much for his ears. Then there was the construction. Machinery whirled and ticked, grinding, and then let's add a little bit of a simile. Grinding like the traffic beside it. Unending. That's not the best simile. Grinding like what? Well, he's from maybe a farm. Grinding like a combine at harvest time. Except that harvest only lasted a few weeks. Here, the noise went on for ages, unending. And then maybe we have a description of what the people sound like as they're jostling along, and they're maybe yelling at the cars as they're almost hit. They're yelling to each other. You have excited tourists chattering about how they're going to see the Empire State Building. You have a child who runs off into the road, and the mom has to scream and get them back, and it's all too much for Greg. All too much. Maybe there's a street performer who is playing music on the corner, and in the midst of all this cacophony, we have a saxophone, and the melodious notes are the only thing that Greg wants to focus on as people are shrieking around him, and he goes over to listen to the man playing and throws $1 in his hat. That would be, I think, a very interesting scene with a lot of those auditory details, and we're kind of pulled into the story, which is the point of imagery, to pull your reader in and to give them a picture of what's going on, to make them feel like they're really there. So, kinesthetic, I'm getting excited. Kinesthetic imagery has to do with movement. So it is words describing movement. So some things to think about. Sometimes kinesthetic involves touch, which we're going to also describe later, which is tactile imagery. But touch, physical movement, things like temperature, the natural, is it natural? Is it unnatural? All of those types of things can be involved in describing the way that things move. So let's have an example. Let's say that we're in a totally different setting. Let's say we're in a western town, and the horses reared up and plunged forward. Jolting the carriage as they dashed toward the river. The carriage bounced along its new path, and okay, let me put, as the carriage bounced along its new path, Frank hauled himself up and looked out the window. "Runaway horses!" he cried. Now, I don't know what happened to the guy driving, but maybe he can't hold on. Maybe he's passed out. Maybe he's had a heart attack. At any rate, let's say with, I want to be careful about my adverbs here, as I just warned you guys a second ago. How I want him to get up and grab the reins, right? How can I do that in a way that seems realistic? Unrealistic. He just pops out the window and hops up onto the stagecoach or the carriage thing. I guess this would be a coach and not a carriage. Thinking about how those are built. At any rate, okay. At any rate, I'm thinking as I'm typing here. So, typically, Frank moved with the grace of a buffalo. A little bit of a comparison there for visual interest. Now he knew some finesse was needed as they so I would go on to kind of describe how he opens the door, sets his feet up while trying to hold on to this bouncing carriage, and then sits to take the reins. But what do we have here? We have reared up, we have plunged forward, we have jolting, we have dash, it's bouncing. Frank is hauling himself up. Maybe he was drinking and sleeping before. We don't know. We have that typically he moved with the grace of a buffalo, and now he needs finesse. So a lot of different words to describe what's going on. Action words, right? They don't move. Do I have swiftly in here someplace? I don't, because I have they dashed, right? If I had moving swiftly, I might take that out. And I probably want to have something like suddenly. Now, this isn't the best piece of writing, but I think that you can get the idea of how you would build some of these movement details into your story. Yeah, dance, movement, action. Adding action to your scene. Again, a lot of people think that imagery has to just do with these flowery details that we add to the setting and we describe everything that the character sees. But, you know, if you have a fast-moving plot, some kinesthetic imagery can really help you out quite a bit. So, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and olfactory. Olfactory is not, if I can spell it correctly, olfactory has to do with details regarding things you can smell. We do not see this in literature as much as the other types because smell, I think, is really intimately connected with memory, and I think it's also difficult to describe. It's also kind of connected to taste, which is going to come up next. But yeah, this sensory detail I don't see as much in literature, but let's do a quick example. Let's say that someone's cooked a meal, but instead of describing how it tastes, we're going to describe how it smells. So, Phoebe was wary when she saw the meal Dan had cooked for her. She was even more, I don't want to say wary again, and I don't want to say trepidatious, although it's, I'll say suspicious. She was even more suspicious as she approached the table to smell his, I'm going to put this in air quotes, dinner. I wouldn't do that for real because I think people would be confused by the quotes, but here you're like, I smelled the dinner, and I'm not quite sure about this. Burnt toast was the first thing that came to mind, though there didn't seem to be any bread on the table. Then the aroma of rotting fish hung in the air by the chair he held out for her. Again, a quick survey told her no fish was being served. What the heck did this guy make? There was a bowl of cooked cabbage, but rather than the bright, springy scent that vegetable typically carried, it too it stunk of sulfur. And sulfur? Capital? Okay. Almost as if he had attempted to ferment it? Surely not. Phoebe thought. Surely he wouldn't try to make something as difficult as kimchi. I think I'm spelling this right. Let me check it. It's not, because I don't eat it. Kimchi. As difficult as kimchi the first time he cooked. Sadly, Phoebe was mistaken. So, a little bit of a funny scene here, but what kind of things do we have? We have burnt toast. We have rotting fish. We have bright and springy as kind of describing scent. We have sulfurous, which is different kind of a thing. So bits here kind of in and among her feelings about this dinner that would describe how it smells. So you can think about adding some smells to your story. I think they might have fit even a little bit better going up here. Where is it? Who was Greg? in New York City. Maybe he smells things that he did not smell before. Maybe the city smells of sweat, and to him, garbage, and it's hard for him to breathe because there's so much pollution in the air, and he's used to this clean, crisp mountain air and the smell of lakes and rivers and cow pastures, right? So, next up. Nope. Try that again. Next up is, there we go. Next up is tactile. Oh, I'm sorry. Gustatory. Gustatory has to do with imagery describing what we taste. And if you are writing a menu and you're in a culinary program as you're watching this, you need to pay attention because this will help you sell your food. Yeah, what's interesting about gustatory imagery to me is that you have some tactile, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that has to do with touch. Things like texture, temperature, those kind of things. You also have, as we just discussed, olfactory, because these senses are really connected, right? So let's do a very brief example. Mary sipped at her glass of wine. Other people seemed to enjoy it and commented on its oaky. I don't drink wine, so I'm thinking here. Oaky richness and hints of almond and vanilla. But all Mary was picking up were the bits of sediment floating at the bottom of her glass. Thinking the sushi might be better, she maybe the sushi's better than the wine. Thinking the sushi might be better, she chose a piece. What was it going to have in it that smelled less fishy than the rest? Philadelphia roll with rice that was a bit underdone, bland and crunchy, but at least the salt from the soy sauce gave a bit of flavor to the less than savory piece. I don't know. But there we go. Okay. There are a lot of other things that you can do here. You know, I should have listed before too. Salt, sugar, bitter, sour, umami, that has to do with kind of meaty, fatty, savory, those kind of things, as opposed to the sweet. So salty, sweet, bitter, sour, savory. So we've got savory, we've got a little bit of salt, we've got the rice being underdone, which is of course kind of a texture thing, right? We have bland. We have that it smelled less fishy. She doesn't like that. Mary's having a bad day. The bits of sediment are kind of a texture thing, right? The hints of almond and vanilla, oaky richness. Maybe it's been over-oaked, which can happen when wine is put into barrels. It tends to take on a little bit of the taste of the barrel. So those are the kind of details that you can think about. I don't have hot and cold in here, but I certainly could. I could have, there we go, cold rice that's a bit underdone, bland and crunchy. I think a Philadelphia roll might have crab and cream cheese? I know it has cream cheese, that's why it's Philadelphia. Who's to say? At any rate, you are probably somebody watching this has a lot to say about. So those are the things that you can add when you're thinking about gustatory imagery. Tactile is has to do with describing touch. So things like temperature, texture. Sometimes this can also involve a little bit of movement. A lot of times, as I've said, these things kind of go together. Many times we don't typically feel one sense at a time. We have many senses kind of coming together, so that kinesthetic imagery can be there. So let's give a brief example. It wasn't just hot. It was stifling. The humidity made Jim feel like he was swimming underwater. So again, for imagery here, we have kind of a little bit of a simile. Humidity made Jim feel like he was underwater. Sweat dripped down his back, pooling at the ridge of his belt, I guess. Pooling, no, let's have pooling in his shoes and making each step squelch and squeak. A little bit of kinesthetic and auditory. Let's say that he's took off his, why he's wearing flannel, I don't know, his soft flannel shirt and let the heat of the day soak into his bare skin. Okay, now, it doesn't make any sense, and I would never put this in an actual book, because why is he wearing a flannel shirt on a hot day? But we have hot, we have stifling, we have a simile here that I'll put in green, we have sweat that's dripping, so a little bit of movement there, but you can kind of feel it, it's pooling. We have the auditory imagery there. We have soft, that's a tactile word. We have the heat, and that is soaking into him. So a lot of different tactile things here, and you can kind of, as a reader, hopefully feel the heat of the day and wonder why the hell Jim is wearing a flannel shirt if it's so hot and humid outside and he's sweating and walking in his own sweat. Gross. So last type of imagery is organic. Now, sometimes people break this into two, and sometimes they have just one. The other word I will get to in a minute, but essentially this has to do with describing the personal experiences of a character. Now, sometimes people break this up to say that organic has only to do with physical things, organic to us, physical details and desires. So things like hunger, thirst, fatigue, pain, anxiety, the physical things of anxiety, rapid heart beating, things like that. Sometimes people have another word, phenomenological, and that has to do with the mental and emotional details. Now, I tend to use the word organic for both, because if you think of something like anxiety, there are physical things, but there are also mental and emotional things there. So you have both terms. So an example, let's describe somebody who's having some anxiety. I don't want to tell you that she's having an anxiety attack. I want to show you with my imagery. So I almost did some telling there, but then I pulled back. So Hetty's heart beat. I want an interesting comparison here. Hetty's heart beat like the feet of a wild rabbit running through the woods. Like a wild rabbit running away from what would prey on a rabbit. Like a wild rabbit. Most rabbits are wild, so let's say like a small rabbit running away from a blood-thirsty, one word, hawk. Hetty's heart beat like the feet of a small rabbit running away from a bloodthirsty hawk. I think that's kind of an interesting image there. Not perfect, but I would revise it a couple more times, likely, if I were going to use it, but let's start with that. So I don't want to just say her heart's beating rapidly, right? I want some interesting imagery here, so that works. She's going to be sweating too, I think. Her hands. Her fingers went numb and her vision blurred. So far, we have just those physical details, right? No, I don't. I want it as two. It's not her heartbeat. It's her heart beating. There we go. Hetty's heart was beating like the feet of a small rabbit running away from a bloodthirsty hawk. Her fingers went numb and her vision blurred. Panic rose in her chest. That's a little bit more prosaic. That's fine. It's telling us about panic. She could not go to the front of the room. She could not answer a math problem incorrectly in front of everyone. Her mind screamed. Okay, so we have some of those feelings there, okay? But we've got her heart's beating, we have her fingers going numb, we have her vision blurring. These are those organic details. Then we have moving into her feelings, panic. She doesn't want to do things incorrectly, so she's embarrassed. We get that she's having a panic attack, even though I'm not saying Hetty had a panic attack, right? We have those kind of things. So last things to consider. I talked before about balance. I talked before about style. You can think about using interesting words, particularly strong words. you can think about using interesting comparisons. And lastly, you can use tools to help. So things like you can right click and use the thesaurus. You can, there are some tools online. I'm going to show you a couple of them. I have that I've created. This is so nerdy, but as a writer, a little color thesaurus for myself. I'll move that over so you can see it better. Yeah, so are somebody's lips, is somebody's face rosy? Or have they gone scarlet with embarrassment? Is somebody dye their hair and did it come out strawberry blonde or pumpkin? Some of these are like paint colors, but I don't always use them directly. But you can do something like this. There is online. This other professor has made this great, and I think I have pictures of it someplace. There we go. She's made a visual thesaurus for colors, and I've downloaded a few of them. I sent her my list because there were a lot on there that she didn't have, and then I added some from hers to mine. So the sand was the color of a sugar cookie. The sand was the color of biscotti. Those kind of things. These are tans. Right? Then we have whites, then we have yellows. There's so many different words that you can use instead of yellow. Sometimes yellow is enough, but sometimes you want that it's buttery, it's flaxen, it's reminds you of a golden daffodil, and combine two of those, right? So that's a great tool that you can look up the color thesaurus. There are a couple other ones that I use. That was from setting. This is a list to describe smells. I find that sometimes helpful. Antiseptic versus sour. Do you have a nurse who smells like antiseptic, or does he or she smell like sweat? Or do they smell lemony and delightful? There are a lot of, this is a bad taste thesaurus. I don't remember where I found this, but I love it so much. Roasted, meaty, cheesy, earthy, mustardy, things that don't taste that great. Then I've got, I love thesauruses, if you can't tell. Is this one tastes as well? Yeah, so we have green, briny and salty, fresh, citrusy, earthy, those kind of things. There are also some that have to do with wine. This doesn't look like it is, but I have a wine thesaurus someplace. I don't drink wine, but I really find the way that wine is described, as I had in that example earlier, it's kind of interesting. So yeah, smoky, moldy, tar, plastic, all of these aromas. So you can find things for taste, you can find things for aromas. I have 200 words to describe light, so great for visual imagery. I'll open this up a bit more so you can see it closer. There we go. Gentle, somber, nostalgic, harsh lighting. Is it for dancing? Is it superficial? Is it clear? Is it blinding? All of these types of things. So I would say a thesaurus is a great tool to help, and a dictionary as well if you, and I'll put in here visual thesaurus, which a lot of those are. So things to think about as you're writing: balance, style, strong words, interesting comparisons. And if you need those tools, you can look them up online, and they're certainly quite helpful and enjoyable and fun to use. So that's it. I can't wait to see what you come up with. Thanks, everybody.